In the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The soft shuffle of paper and the occasional murmur of whispers filled the room as cases were called one after another. Judge Robert Turner sat at the bench, his gaze steady and unyielding. His reputation for fairness and his strict adherence to the law made him a respected figure in the legal community today. He was ready to preside over another mundane case that would soon be forgotten, a simple traffic violation, a minor infraction, he thought. But then Maria Lawson walked in and everything changed. Maria was a woman of presence, tall, confident, and composed. Her dark hair framed her face perfectly as she stood at the front of the room. She wasn't like most of the defendants who came before him. This wasn't her first time in a courtroom, but there was something about her that made Judge Turner pause. He had seen many people come and go from the courtroom, but Maria's calmness was different. It wasn't the sort of nervousness or pleading that many defendants showed. It was more like she knew exactly what she was doing, and where she was standing. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly as he scanned her. She seemed familiar, but he couldn't place where he had seen her before. The case was simple enough. She was being charged with a minor parking violation, nothing that should have stood out, but Judge Turner's mind was already made up. She would be treated like any other defendant in his courtroom. He was a man of principles, and the law would be followed strictly. He glanced over at Maria and saw no sign of regret or even anxiety in her expression. She explained the circumstances of her infraction calmly and succinctly, but there was a hint of determination in her voice that struck the judge. He couldn't quite understand it. Perhaps it was because of the way she carried herself, or the lack of hesitation in her words. Either way, it irritated him just a little. Judge Turner felt an urge to assert control in the situation. He listened attentively, but his mind was already calculating the fine she would be issued. As he glanced at his notes and then back at Maria, he made his decision swiftly. The fine would be set at the maximum allotted by law. She had been given her chance to explain herself, but her composure had given him the impression that she thought she could somehow avoid the rules of the courtroom. He spoke the words firmly and authoritatively, but something about the way she stood there, unaffected by his pronouncement, made him wonder if he had been too hasty in his judgment. Maria didn't flinch. She simply nodded as if she had anticipated the outcome from the beginning. She made no fuss and didn't try to argue or plead. She accepted the decision with quiet dignity and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The judge was left with a strange feeling. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, but something about the way she carried herself had left him unsettled. As the next case was called and the day moved on, the judge couldn't shake the thought of Maria Lawson. There was something about her that felt like more than just a defendant in a courtroom, and he couldn't figure out why. But little did he know this was just the beginning of an encounter that would change everything for both of them. As Maria stepped out of the courtroom, she felt the weight of the fine settle in. But it wasn't the money that bothered her. She had dealt with far more significant battles in her life than a simple traffic violation. What lingered in her mind was the judge's demeanor. There was something about the way he had looked at her, something almost dismissive, as if her calmness had been mistaken for arrogance. She knew her rights. She knew how to handle herself in the legal system. But today something felt off. Her heels clicked against the courthouse floor as she walked toward the exit, her thoughts already drifting toward her next class. Maria was a law professor at the local university, and today she would be teaching her students about legal ethics and the complexities of justice. Yet she couldn't help but feel that the exchange with Judge Turner had left an imprint on her. The more she thought about it, the more she wondered if it was just her imagination, or if the judge had treated her differently because of who she was, a black woman standing in a place where she wasn't expected to stand. As she neared the door, a voice broke through her thoughts. "Professor Lawson." A young attorney named Sarah called out. She was a clerk in the courthouse and had noticed Maria walking by. Maria turned and smiled. "Yes. I'm so sorry to bother you," Sarah said, her voice tinged with both excitement and hesitation. "I didn't realize you were the one in front of Judge Turner today." I'm a huge fan of your work. I've read several of your papers on judicial ethics and civil rights. I've always wanted to meet you in person." Maria's smile widened, appreciating the compliment. "It's nice to meet you too," she said warmly. I'm glad you've read my work." But Sarah's tone shifted slightly, and there was a touch of confusion in her eyes. I couldn't believe it when I saw you in court today. You're Professor Lawson, the one who teaches future lawyers and challenges systemic injustices, and yet, the judge fined you. I thought it was a minor issue, but the way he handled it seemed." She trailed off, searching for the right word. Mariah raised an eyebrow, now more curious than before. "Seemed how?" she asked, her voice gentle yet probing. "Unnecessary," Sarah finished. "It felt like he wasn't treating you with the respect you deserve. I just didn't expect to see you in that situation, and certainly not with him. But then again, it was probably just the formality of the process, right?" Mariah remained quiet for a moment, processing Sarah's words. The judge's behavior had stood out to her too, and hearing Sarah's reaction confirmed that it hadn't just been her imagination. She had been in enough courtrooms to know the dynamics, how things could shift based on who was sitting at the bench. But hearing it from someone else, especially a young lawyer, gave her perspective on what had happened. "Well," Mariah said after a long pause, "I don't know what his intentions were, but you're probably right. The system often works in ways we don't fully see, and sometimes people make decisions without considering the full picture. I'll just take it as it comes." Sarah nodded, but there was an undercurrent of concern in her eyes. "Just be careful. People like Judge Turner, they get set in their ways, and sometimes those ways aren't as open-minded as they should be." Mariah smiled again, appreciating Sarah's concern, but she was already moving on. "Thank you for your kind words. I appreciate your perspective, but don't worry about me. I've been through far worse than a parking fine." As Mariah left the courthouse, her mind buzzed with a mixture of thoughts. She had encountered judgment in many forms throughout her career, but something about today's exchange felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something that would lead her down a path of unexpected encounters and revelations. What started as a simple fine had already become much more than just a minor legal issue. It had become a question of fairness, perception, and the unspoken rules of the courtroom. The next morning, Mariah arrived at the university early, as she always did. Her office was a small but organized space, filled with books, papers, and a few framed awards. The room smelled faintly of coffee, a comforting scent that always helped her focus. She quickly sifted through her emails, answered a few pressing questions from students, and prepared her lecture notes for the day ahead. Mariah had been a law professor for nearly a decade, and in that time, she had shaped the minds of countless future lawyers, judges, and advocates. But no matter how busy or how hectic her schedule became, she always found herself at ease in the classroom. As she walked across the campus, her thoughts returned to the events of yesterday. The encounter with Judge Turner still lingered, like a loose thread she couldn't quite pull together. It wasn't just the fine that bothered her. It was the way he had looked at her, the way he seemed to assume that she, of all people, was undeserving of fairness. In her years of teaching, Mariah had seen this kind of subtle bias too many times, especially in the legal system. It was the kind of bias that wasn't loud or obvious, but quiet and insidious, often hidden under layers of professional courtesy or formality. Mariah had always been outspoken about systemic injustices in the law. She had written about them, lectured on them, and fought against them. She had seen firsthand the way the legal system often failed to protect those who needed it most, and while she had learned to navigate that system with precision and grace, moments like yesterday reminded her just how much work there was still left to be done. Her students, though, were a bright spot in her life. She loved teaching, loved seeing the spark in their eyes when they began to understand the complexity of the law. Today's lecture was on legal ethics, a subject she felt particularly passionate about. As the students filed into the classroom, Mariah greeted each one with a smile, knowing that today's lesson would spark more than just legal debate. It would challenge them to think critically about justice, fairness, and the role of a judge. The lecture began, and Mariah immediately commanded the room. Her voice was calm but firm, and the students listened intently as she discussed the ethical dilemmas that lawyers and judges faced. She spoke about the importance of empathy, the need to consider the human element behind every case, and the ways in which bias, conscious or unconscious, could shape the outcome of legal proceedings. It was a subject Mariah knew well, and she was eager to instill in her students the values of fairness and equity. As the class went on, Mariah found herself caught in her own thoughts, reflecting on the words she had just spoken. How often did people, especially those in positions of power, act without truly considering the consequences of their actions? How many judges, like the one she had encountered yesterday, believed they were acting impartially, when in fact their biases were quietly influencing their decisions? Her mind wandered back to Judge Turner, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. She knew that her work wasn't just about teaching the law. It was about challenging those who wielded power in the legal system to question their assumptions and biases. Mariah wasn't one to shy away from difficult conversations, and she wondered if Judge Turner might be someone who needed to be challenged. After the lecture, as the students trickled out, Mariah sat at her desk, contemplating the next steps. She didn't know what the future held or whether she would ever cross paths with the judge again. But one thing was certain. This experience had ignited a spark in her. She couldn't let it go. Whether she was challenging her students or engaging with powerful figures in the legal world, Mariah knew that her work was far from finished. There were conversations to be had, biases to be confronted, and justice to be pursued. And she would continue to lead that charge. One case, one conversation at a time. Judge Robert Turner sat alone in his chambers late that afternoon, his usual confidence clouded by a sense of unease. He stared at the case file in front of him, the papers neatly stacked, but somehow lacking the usual clarity they provided. The words Mariah Lawson lingered in his mind, haunting him in a way that he couldn't fully explain. There was something about her, about the way she had presented herself in the courtroom, that had unsettled him. He had known from the moment she walked in that her case was a minor one, hardly the kind of charge that would typically warrant a moment's more consideration. Parking violations were routine, dismissed with little more than a flick of the wrist, so to speak. Yet when he'd looked at Mariah, standing there so composed, so calm, something had shifted in him. He had been too quick to issue that fine. He knew it, but why? His thoughts turned back to the conversation with his colleague earlier that day. During their lunch break, Judge Turner had been casually chatting with a fellow judge about a recent paper he'd read on racial disparities in the legal system. His colleague had mentioned Mariah Lawson's name. Her work had been featured prominently in several legal journals for her advocacy on behalf of marginalized communities and the study of racial bias in legal decisions. Her name had come up in conversation more than once in the past few months, especially as discussions about judicial reform became more urgent. That was when it hit him. Mariah Lawson wasn't just any woman he had found. She was the same person who had spoken at conferences and written influential papers on the very biases that could creep into courtrooms like his. He had found a prominent legal scholar, an advocate for justice, a woman who had dedicated her career to addressing the very issues he had ignored. A knot twisted in his stomach as he thought back to the moment when she had stood in front of him with such poise. She hadn't protested. She hadn't tried to argue. She hadn't even seemed surprised. Instead, she had accepted the fine with the same quiet dignity that she exuded in everything she did. But that acceptance only seemed to amplify the discomfort that had been growing in him since she walked out of the courtroom. Judge Turner pushed the papers aside and stood up, pacing back and forth across his small office. He had always prided himself on his impartiality, on making decisions based solely on the law. But now, with the weight of his mistake bearing down on him, he couldn't help but wonder if he had fallen into a trap of his own making. The law was supposed to be fair, wasn't it? He had worked for years to uphold that principle. But was it really possible to be fair without recognizing the biases that shaped each decision? It was then that the realization hit him fully. He hadn't just found a person. He had treated someone differently based on his own assumptions. The more he thought about it, the more disgusted he became with himself. His actions in the courtroom hadn't been about the law. They had been about his perception of her, an unconscious bias that he had allowed to influence his judgment. And that, he realized, was something that no judge should ever allow. Feeling a deep sense of regret, Judge Turner knew that he had to make this right. He couldn't let this mistake define his career. He would need to apologize to Maria, to acknowledge what had happened, and perhaps more importantly, he needed to understand why it had happened in the first place. He picked up his phone, staring at it for a moment before dialing her number. He had no idea what he would say, but he knew that this conversation was one he had to have. The phone rang several times before a calm, measured voice answered. "Hello, this is Maria Lawson," she said, and there was no trace of surprise or hesitation in her tone. "Professor Lawson," Judge Turner began, clearing his throat. "This is Judge Robert Turner. I was hoping we could talk." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then Maria replied, her voice steady but curious. "Of course, Judge Turner. What can I do for you?" The words felt heavy in his mouth. He had always been someone who prided himself on control, on making swift, sound decisions that reflected his years of experience on the bench. But today, he was uncertain, uncomfortable. This wasn't just about a mistake in the courtroom. It was about confronting his own assumptions and the subtle biases he had failed to recognize in himself. I owe you an apology," he said, his voice sincere but tinged with unease. "I made a mistake in your case yesterday, and I wanted to reach out personally to acknowledge it. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve, and I regret the way I handled things." Maria didn't respond immediately. She didn't rush to forgive him, nor did she express anger. Instead, there was a long pause, as if she were carefully considering her next words. "Why?" she asked, her voice calm but probing. "Why did you issue the fine the way you did? And why now, after the fact, are you apologizing?" Judge Turner swallowed hard, the weight of the question hanging between them. I think I acted out of assumption. When I saw you in the courtroom, I didn't recognize you. I didn't realize who you were at first, but even when I did, I still didn't treat you fairly. I made a snap judgment about you, and I think that judgment was clouded by my own biases." Maria was quiet for a moment, the silence stretching out in a way that made the judge feel exposed, vulnerable. Finally, she spoke. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Turner. It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, and I respect that you've taken the first step in doing so. But it's not just about this case. It's about a pattern that's too common in our system." His stomach twisted as she continued. "You see, I've spent my career studying these kinds of situations, how bias can creep into decisions, even when we think we're being objective. And this isn't just about one judge or one case. This is about how systems work and how those in positions of power can unwittingly perpetuate inequality, simply by failing to acknowledge their own biases." Judge Turner's mind raced as he processed her words. What she was saying wasn't new to him. He had read the studies, he had attended the seminars on judicial fairness. But hearing it from someone like Maria, someone who had devoted her life to understanding these issues, made it hit home in a way that nothing else had. "I've spent years trying to make decisions that are fair and just," he said quietly. "But I see now that I've been blind to how my own assumptions can shape my rulings. I need to do better. I want to do better." Maria's tone softened, but it remained firm. "We all have work to do. You're in a position to make a difference, Judge Turner. But that means looking at yourself too. Understanding that fairness isn't just about following the law. It's about understanding the people who come before you and the experiences that shape their lives." Her words hung in the air, heavy and transformative. It was clear that this conversation was not just an apology. It was the beginning of something deeper, something that would force them both to confront uncomfortable truths about the legal system and about themselves. "I understand," he said, his voice full of resolve, "and I want to start by doing the right thing. I want to learn from this. If you'll allow it, I'd like to meet in person and talk more about how I can be more aware, how I can improve as a judge." Maria considered this for a moment before responding, her voice thoughtful. "I'd be open to that. But I think we need to approach this with an open mind and an honest heart. There's a lot of work to be done, but maybe we can start with this conversation." Judge Turner felt a sense of relief wash over him. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful that change was possible. A week passed before Judge Turner and Maria Lawson met in person. They chose a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, away from the formality of the courthouse and the university, where they could speak freely without being overheard. As Turner entered the cafe, he noticed Maria sitting by the window, her posture upright yet relaxed, a book open in front of her, but clearly not engaged with the pages. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held an invitation to sit down. "Thank you for meeting with me, Professor Lawson," Judge Turner said, his voice steady, but filled with a trace of nerves that he rarely felt. Maria smiled politely, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Please, sit. I'm glad we could arrange this meeting." He took his seat, folding his hands on the table, looking at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. He was still processing their last conversation, the weight of it lingering in his thoughts. Today he hoped to understand her perspective more fully, to learn from her in a way that went beyond theory and in textbooks. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said during our phone conversation," he began, "about how fairness in the courtroom isn't just about applying the law, but about recognizing the humanity behind each case. I've spent my career focused on the law, but I've come to realize that I've overlooked the very thing you've been advocating for, that we need to understand the people who come before us in a much deeper way." Maria leaned back in her chair, her eyes studying him carefully, as though assessing his sincerity. "It's a difficult thing to confront," she said softly, "but it's also one of the most important things a judge can do. We all bring our own experiences and biases into every situation, whether we're aware of them or not, and the legal system is not immune to that." Turner nodded, taking in her words. He had always considered himself a fair man, someone who treated all his cases equally. But Maria was right. There were layers to fairness that went far beyond the surface of legal precedent and written statutes. He had been so focused on the black and white aspects of the law that he had ignored the complexities of the people standing before him, the lives they led, the struggles they faced. "You mentioned unconscious bias," Turner said, trying to steer the conversation toward a place where he could gain deeper insight. "Can you explain more about how that works? How it affects decisions, even when we think we're being impartial?" Maria's eyes brightened as she leaned forward, clearly passionate about the topic. Unconscious bias is the automatic, unintentional associations we make based on our experiences, culture, and upbringing. It affects everyone: judges, lawyers, police officers, even jurors. It's not about intention or malice. It's about patterns of thought that we've absorbed over time, patterns that shape how we see people, how we make decisions. She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. For example, studies have shown that black defendants are more likely to be perceived as guilty, more likely to receive harsher sentences than their white counterparts, even when all other factors are equal. That's not because judges are intentionally racist, but because these biases exist on a subconscious level and influence their actions without them realizing it. Turner felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had read about unconscious bias before, of course, but hearing it articulated so clearly, so personally, made it impossible to ignore. "And the system," Maria continued, "doesn't help. The legal system, in many ways, was built on these biases. It's been ingrained in how we approach cases, how we evaluate people, how we assess guilt and innocence. Changing that requires more than just awareness. It requires action, introspection, and the willingness to confront these uncomfortable truths." Judge Turner sat back, absorbing her words. He realized that this conversation was just the beginning. It wasn't going to be easy. There was no quick fix, no simple answer. But it was necessary. If he was going to be the judge he had always aspired to be, he had to start dismantling the prejudices that had unknowingly shaped his decisions. "How do we change it?" he asked, his voice quiet but determined. "How do I begin to change my approach?" Maria smiled, a hint of warmth in her expression. "It starts with being willing to acknowledge that change is necessary. It starts with a commitment to learning and growing, to challenging yourself and the systems that have been in place for centuries. And it takes courage to admit when you've made mistakes and to take responsibility for those mistakes." Judge Turner nodded, a sense of purpose rising within him. He had a long road ahead, but this meeting, this conversation, had opened his eyes to the work that lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Over the following weeks, Judge Turner made a concerted effort to follow through on the lessons he had learned from his conversation with Maria. The first step, he realized, was not just acknowledging his biases, but actively seeking ways to address them. It wasn't going to be easy. As someone who had spent years adhering to the idea of objectivity, the thought of confronting his unconscious prejudices was intimidating. But the more he reflected on his actions and the words Maria had shared, the more he understood that true impartiality meant recognizing the deeper complexities of the human beings who appeared in his courtroom. One of the first changes he made was to attend a series of seminars on bias and its role in the legal system. These workshops, which had long been available but often overlooked by many in his profession, focused on recognizing implicit biases and learning how to counteract them. Turner found himself in uncomfortable situations during these sessions, questioning long-held beliefs, confronting uncomfortable truths about himself, and realizing just how much of his judgment had been unconsciously shaped by societal stereotypes. But with each uncomfortable moment came the clarity that change was not just necessary but vital. Maria, too, became a more prominent presence in his thoughts. After their meeting at the cafe, they had exchanged occasional emails, discussing articles and studies about bias in the legal system. Maria had even invited him to attend one of her lectures on social justice and legal ethics, where she spoke passionately about the importance of diversity in the legal profession and the ongoing fight for racial equity. He had been impressed by her dedication to making real change, not just in theory, but in practice. It was clear to him that she wasn't just a scholar. She was someone who lived and breathed the principles she taught. One day, as Turner was sitting in his chambers, reviewing an upcoming case, he found his mind wandering again to the impact of unconscious bias. The case on his desk involved a young black man accused of theft. The evidence was circumstantial, and there were no clear witnesses. Turner had learned enough by now to recognize that this was the kind of case where assumptions could easily color his judgment, particularly given the racial disparities that existed in the legal system. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. A court clerk entered, holding a folder in her hands. "Judge Turner, there's a request for a meeting regarding this case," she said, her voice cautious. "It's from the defense attorney. They'd like to speak with you in person before the trial proceeds." Turner nodded. "Set it up. I'll make time for them." As the days passed, he found himself reading more deeply into the case than he ever would have before. The young man's history, his background, and the circumstances surrounding the alleged theft began to tell a story of hardship, poverty, and a system that had failed him at every turn. Turner could feel his perspective shifting, but it wasn't until he met with the defense attorney that his awareness fully deepened. The defense attorney, a sharp, passionate woman named Clara, arrived in his chambers a few days later. After a few pleasantries, she launched into a detailed explanation of the case, highlighting not only the legal arguments but also the social factors that had contributed to the young man's involvement in the crime. She spoke about his upbringing, his struggles with systemic poverty, and how the court system had often been an adversary rather than an ally. Turner listened intently, realizing that his initial view of the case had been shaped by assumptions he hadn't even been aware of. The defendant wasn't just a faceless figure in a court file. He was a product of a system that had failed him at every turn. It was a sobering realization, but it also reinforced what Maria had taught him about understanding the human side of justice. "Thank you, Clara," Turner said after a long silence. "You've given me much to think about." She smiled, nodding. "That's all we can ask for, Your Honor. That's all we can ask for." As she left his chambers, Turner felt the weight of his responsibility settle on him. He had learned something valuable that day, that the law was not just about upholding rules and regulations, but about understanding people and their circumstances. It wasn't just about applying legal precedent. It was about being fair and compassionate, even in the most difficult of cases. Maria's words echoed in his mind as he sat down at his desk to review the case again, this time with a clearer perspective. He knew that the road to change wasn't simple, and it wasn't linear. But each step he took, no matter how small, was a step toward becoming the kind of judge who truly saw people, not just cases. Weeks passed, and Judge Turner continued his journey toward self-reflection and growth. His new commitment to fairness and justice was taking root, but he knew it wasn't going to be a quick or easy transformation. Every day brought new challenges, new cases, and new moments where he had to check himself, questioning his assumptions before making any judgments. It was a process of constant awareness, and he found that it required a humility he hadn't fully embraced before. One morning, as he prepared for a full day of hearings, he received a letter that caught him by surprise. It was from Maria. She had written him to thank him for the recent changes he had made, particularly in how he had handled some of the cases in his court. Maria's words were carefully chosen, her tone encouraging, yet still holding him accountable. Judge Turner. The letter began. I've been following your recent rulings with interest, and I want to commend you for the thoughtful way you've approached your cases, particularly those involving young people of color. It's evident that you're trying to balance the law with a deeper understanding of the circumstances that inform each situation. I can't tell you how important it is to see someone in your position striving to understand the complexities of justice. It's a long road, but your willingness to take those first steps speaks volumes. Reading her letter, Turner felt a mixture of pride and humility. He hadn't expected such direct acknowledgement, especially from someone whose work he so deeply respected. But Maria wasn't one to offer praise lightly. Her letter was a reminder that the changes he had been working toward were not just important for his own growth, but for the communities he served. Later that day, Turner found himself reflecting on a particular case he had ruled on just the previous week. It had been a complex situation. A young black woman had been charged with possession of a controlled substance, but the circumstances of her arrest had raised serious questions about police misconduct. Turner had carefully considered all the evidence, weighing the legal facts against the broader social context. It wasn't just about the law. It was about the person standing before him, someone who had been caught in a system that hadn't always been fair to her. In the end, Turner had decided to drop the charges, recognizing that the young woman had been unfairly targeted, and that the law, in this instance, wasn't serving justice. The decision had drawn attention in the legal community, and some of his colleagues had questioned it, but Turner stood by it. He had learned to see beyond the surface, to look deeper into the human story behind every case. As he continued to challenge himself, Turner realized that his transformation was not just about making better rulings in individual cases. It was about reshaping his entire approach to the law. He began to host discussions with other judges about unconscious bias, diversity, and how to create a more inclusive and just legal system. Some were resistant to change, but others were intrigued, and over time, Turner began to feel that he wasn't just altering his own approach to the law, but influencing others as well. One afternoon, Turner invited Maria to speak at a gathering of judges and lawyers he had organized, hoping to foster more dialogue about equity in the justice system. Maria, of course, agreed, and when she stood before the group of legal professionals, she spoke passionately, but with a quiet strength that captivated everyone in the room. After the talk, Turner couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the woman who had not only challenged his beliefs, but had given him the tools to reshape his approach to justice. He realized that their encounter had been the catalyst for his own evolution, and though it had begun with an uncomfortable mistake, it had led to something powerful, a commitment to fairness, humility, and understanding. As he walked out of the courthouse that evening, his thoughts turned to the future. The journey wasn't over. It would never be over. But for the first time, Turner felt confident that he was on the right path, a path that, with every decision, would bring him closer to the kind of judge he had always aspired to be, one who saw not just the law, but the people who stood before him, with all their complexities, struggles, and humanity.